In the autumn of 1867, along a forgotten stretch of road between Joplin and Springfield, Missouri, federal investigators discovered something that would haunt the Ozarks for generations. Hidden beneath the floorboards of Sullivan's trading post were ledgers containing the names, descriptions, and estimated wealth of over 300 travelers. Next to each entry, written in meticulous Irish script, were notations that would chill any lawman to the bone. Route taken, Devil's Backbone Trail, expected return none, gold recovered $2,400. The final entry dated just 2 weeks before the discovery simply read, H. Zimmerman, German prospector traveling alone, estimated $8,000 in dust, Sha nervous. Patrick says, we finish this one then leave Missouri for good. What authorities uncovered in that remote trading post would expose the most sophisticated murder conspiracy in post-Civil War America, a network of corruption that reached into the very heart of Southwest Missouri's power structure. Before we continue with the story of Patrick and Sha Sullivan, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear for more dark historical mysteries, and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our audience across America. The Sullivan brothers' story begins not with their crimes, but with the very landscape that would enable them. The wild, untamed Ozark Mountains of post-Civil War Missouri, where federal authority was weak and local law was whatever men with guns decided it should be. The year 1867 found Southwest Missouri in a state of barely controlled chaos. The Civil War had ended just 2 years prior, but its wounds ran deep through the Ozark Hills. Former Confederate guerrillas still roamed the dense forests, now turned common bandits. Union veterans, many of them Irish immigrants who had fought for the promise of land and prosperity, found themselves struggling to carve out a living in a region that viewed them with suspicion and hostility. It was into this environment that Patrick and Sha Sullivan arrived in the spring of 1864, two brothers from County Cork who had served with the 9th Missouri Infantry. Patrick, the elder at 32, possessed a sharp mind for business and an even sharper tongue that could charm information from the weariest traveler. Sha, 28, and built like a prize fighter, had learned during the war that violence, properly applied, could solve most problems that charm could not. They established their trading post at what locals called Hellhound Crossing, where the main road from Joplin to Springfield intersected with Devil's Backbone Trail, a treacherous but shorter route through the heart of the Ozarks. The location was perfect, remote enough to avoid regular federal patrols, but positioned at a critical junction where weary travelers would gladly pay for supplies, information, and a safe place to rest. The trading post itself was an unremarkable structure, a log building with a false front to make it appear larger, shelves stocked with basic provisions and tables where travelers could sit and share a drink. What made it remarkable was the brothers' ability to make every visitor feel like they were receiving privileged information. Patrick had a gift for making men trust him within minutes of meeting, while Sean's intimidating presence ensured that loose tongues stayed loose and suspicious minds stayed quiet. The Missouri Ozarks of 1867 were experiencing an unusual economic boom. The California gold rush was winding down, and many prospectors were returning east with their fortunes, taking well-known trails through Missouri on their way to family in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. These men carried not just gold, dust, and nuggets, but also the accumulated earnings from years of backbreaking labor in the Sierra Nevada. They were wealthy, tired, and far from any law that might protect them. The local communities along these routes had mixed feelings about the steady stream of prospectors passing through. While their money was welcome, these were hard men who had survived years in mining camps, men who trusted no one and were quick to violence when threatened. Most merchants found them difficult customers, demanding, suspicious, and likely to cause trouble if they felt cheated. The Sullivan brothers, however, seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to handle even the most difficult travelers. Prospectors who arrived at Hellhound Crossing, suspicious and hostile, would leave hours later, laughing and shaking hands with the brothers, often carrying detailed maps and recommendations for the safest routes to their destinations. What the community didn't understand was that the Sullivan brothers had spent their first year in Missouri not building their business, but building something far more valuable, a network of information and corruption that would make their trading post the center of the most profitable criminal enterprise the Ozarks had ever seen. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in October 1864, when Martha Hensley, the wife of a local farmer, reported a disturbing conversation she had overheard while delivering eggs to the Sullivan trading post. It was just past sunset on October 15th when Martha approached the back entrance of the building, basket of eggs in hand. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. As she raised her hand to knock, she heard voices through the thin log walls. Patrick's lilting Irish accent mixed with another voice she didn't recognize. "The German fellow, Klaus something," the stranger was saying, "LFT here 3 days ago with enough gold to buy half of Springfield. Took the Devil's Backbone route like you suggested. Should have reached the main road by now, but nobody's seen him." Patrick's response chilled her to the bone. Well, that trail can be treacherous, especially for a man traveling alone. Wild country, that is. Anything could happen to a fellow out there. Animals, bandits, accidents. Who's to say? But the timing, the stranger pressed. "It's too convenient. Every time you send someone that way. Now, hold on there." Sean's deeper voice cut in, carrying a tone that made Martha step back from the door. "You questioning our judgment, because if you are, maybe you should take your concerns to Sheriff Dalton. I'm sure he'd be very interested in hearing about your doubts." The silence that followed was pregnant with threat. When the stranger spoke again, his voice was quieter, defeated. No need for that. Just seems like a lot of bad luck on that trail lately." "Bad luck follows some men like a faithful dog," Patrick replied, his tone light again. "Now about that payment we discussed." Martha Hensley crept away from the trading post that night without delivering her eggs, her mind racing with the implications of what she had heard. But who could she tell? Sheriff Thomas Dalton was Patrick Sullivan's drinking companion. The federal marshals rarely came through these parts, and even if they did, what had she really heard? Suspicions and innuendo, nothing more. She decided to keep the conversation to herself, a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, because within 2 weeks, 3 more prospectors would disappear along the Devil's Backbone Trail, and the whispered rumors that had begun to circulate through the Ozark communities would grow into something approaching panic. The pattern was always the same. A prospector would arrive at Sullivan's trading post, usually traveling alone or with a single partner. They would spend several hours drinking and talking with the brothers, discussing routes and road conditions. Patrick would inevitably recommend the Devil's Backbone Trail as a shortcut that would save them a full day of travel. The brothers would provide detailed maps, mark safe camping spots, and even offer to sell supplies for the journey at generous discounts. The travelers would leave in good spirits, grateful for the brothers' hospitality and advice, and then they would vanish as completely as if Earth had swallowed them whole. By December 1864, the disappearances were becoming impossible to ignore. Frederick Steinbeck, a German immigrant who ran a boarding house in Springfield, began keeping track after his brother-in-law Klaus failed to arrive for Christmas as planned. Klaus had written from California, explaining that he would be traveling through Missouri in November and expected to reach Springfield by December 20th. When New Year's Day passed with no word, Frederick began making inquiries along the route Klaus would have taken. The trail led inevitably to Sullivan's trading post. Yes, the brothers remembered Klaus. A pleasant fellow, they said, spoke excellent English despite his accent. He had left their establishment on November 18th, heading northeast on the Devil's Backbone Trail. Patrick produced a detailed map showing exactly which route he had recommended, marked with his own hand, dangerous country through there. Patrick explained to Frederick, his face a picture of genuine concern. We warned him about traveling alone, but he was determined to reach Springfield quickly. Said he had family waiting. Sha nodded gravely, told him he should stick to the main road even if it took longer, but he was worried about bandits on the more traveled routes, thought he'd be safer on the back trails. Frederick left the trading post more confused than enlightened, The brothers' story was plausible, their concern seemed genuine, and they had clearly tried to help Klaus reach his destination safely, but something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite articulate that made him return to the trading post 3 more times over the following weeks, each time hoping to catch some inconsistency in their story. He never did. The Sullivan brothers were far too careful for that. As winter gave way to spring in 1865, the communities between Joplin and Springfield began to notice a disturbing trend. The number of travelers reported missing along the various routes through the Ozarks was climbing steadily, but the disappearances seemed to cluster around specific areas, particularly the network of trails that branched off from the main road near Sullivan's trading post. The response from local authorities was muted at best. Sheriff Thomas Dalton, a former Confederate cavalry officer who had returned to law enforcement after the war's end, publicly attributed the disappearances to the general lawlessness that plagued the region. "We've got Confederate holdouts, Union deserters, bandits, and God knows what else running through these hills," he would tell concerned citizens. "Man travels alone with a fortune in gold. He's taking his life in his hands. That's just the reality of our situation." Privately, however, Dalton was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the pattern of disappearances. Not because he suspected the Sullivan brothers. Quite the contrary. Patrick Sullivan had become one of his most reliable sources of information about criminal activity in the region. The Irishman seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict where trouble was likely to occur, often providing Dalton with tips that led to successful arrests of genuine criminals. In fact, the Sullivan brothers had helped Dalton solve more crimes in their 2 years of operation than he had managed in the previous 5. They reported suspicious characters, identified stolen goods being sold by unscrupulous traders, and even provided testimony that had led to the conviction of several authentic bandits and murderers. This cooperation had earned them not just Dalton's trust, but his protection. When Frederick Steinbeck persisted in asking questions about his missing brother-in-law, it was Dalton who finally told him in no uncertain terms to stop bothering honest businessmen with his wild theories. The Sullivan brothers have done more to bring law and order to this region than any other citizens I can name, Dalton informed Frederick during a heated discussion in his office in March 1865. "They've helped me put genuine criminals behind bars. They've provided information that saved lives, and they've never asked for anything in return except the right to run their legitimate business in peace. Now, I understand you're worried about your family, but that doesn't give you the right to harass good people with unfounded suspicions." Frederick left the sheriff's office that day, knowing he would receive no help from local law enforcement. But he was not the only person asking questions, and the network of concerned families and friends was growing larger with each passing month. Meanwhile, the Sullivan brothers were expanding their operation in ways that would have shocked even their harshest critics. The trading post had become the hub of an information network that stretched from the Kansas border to the Arkansas line. Every traveler who stopped provided valuable intelligence: where they had come from, where they were going, how much money they carried, whether they were traveling alone or in groups. Patrick kept meticulous records of these conversations, but not in the ledgers he showed to customers or the occasional visiting official. Hidden beneath a false floor in the trading post's back room was a collection of notebooks that read like a criminal mastermind's guide to the perfect victim. Each entry contained not just basic information, but psychological profiles that would have impressed trained investigators. Patrick had developed an almost scientific approach to identifying the most profitable targets. Men traveling alone recently returned from California, carrying substantial amounts of gold or cash with family destinations that meant their absence would not be immediately noticed. But the brothers' genius lay not just in victim selection, but in the sophisticated support network they had constructed. The bandits who carried out the actual robberies and murders were just the most visible part of a conspiracy that included merchants who laundered the stolen gold, officials who misdirected investigations, and even ministers who provided false testimonies about the brothers' Christian character. By the spring of 1866, the Sullivan operation had become so successful that it was actually contributing to the economic growth of several Ozark communities. The steady flow of gold being converted into legitimate currency had provided capital for new businesses, funded church construction, and even helped establish the region's first proper school. The bitter irony was that the very prosperity this blood money created gave the brothers an almost unassailable reputation as upstanding community members. They were generous with donations to worthy causes. They employed local men as guides and laborers, and they had never been anything but courteous and helpful to their neighbors. Yet beneath this facade of respectability, the murders continued with clockwork regularity. Each one planned and executed with the precision of a military operation. The investigation that would eventually bring down the Sullivan network began not with law enforcement, but with a grieving mother's determination to learn the truth about her son's disappearance. Elena McGreedy was the widow of a Union officer killed at Shiloh, left to raise her only son Thomas on a small farm in Illinois. When gold was discovered in California 19-year, old Thomas had joined the westward migration against his mother's wishes. Promising to return within 2 years with enough money to buy the farm next to theirs and start his own family, Thomas kept his promise about returning, sending his mother a letter from San Francisco in March 1866, describing his plans to travel home through Missouri. He had been moderately successful in the gold fields and was carrying approximately $3,000 in dust and nuggets, enough to purchase the farm and livestock he had dreamed of. His letter was filled with excitement about his future and gratitude for his mother's sacrifice in raising him alone. When Thomas failed to arrive by his promised date in May, Elena initially assumed he had been delayed by weather or decided to take a longer route. But as weeks turned to months with no word, she made a decision that would prove crucial to exposing the Sullivan conspiracy. She would travel to Missouri herself and retrace her son's planned route. Elena McGreedy was not the typical grieving mother of her era. Her husband's military service had introduced her to the methods of investigation and record-keeping used by Union intelligence officers. She had helped process casualty reports and missing soldier inquiries during the war, giving her experience in the systematic collection and analysis of information. When she arrived in Springfield in August 1866, she came prepared with detailed notes, maps, and a methodical plan for investigating her son's disappearance. Unlike Frederick Steinbeck and other family members who had made emotional appeals to local authorities, Elena approached her investigation like a military operation. She began by visiting every establishment along the route Thomas would have taken, armed with his photograph and detailed physical description. At each stop, she carefully recorded what she was told, noting inconsistencies and gathering information about other missing travelers. The pattern that emerged was both clear and disturbing. Multiple establishments remembered Thomas McCready. He had been a polite, well-spoken young man who asked intelligent questions about road conditions and paid his bills promptly. But after leaving Sullivan's trading post on April 15, 1866, he had simply vanished. When Eleanor finally reached Sullivan's trading post in September, she was already certain that this would be the last place anyone had seen her son alive. What she didn't expect was how thoroughly prepared the brothers would be for her inquiry. Patrick Sullivan welcomed her warmly, expressing genuine sympathy for her loss and immediately producing detailed records of her son's visit. According to his notes, Thomas had arrived on April 15th, purchased supplies, and spent several hours discussing route options. Patrick had recommended the main road to Springfield, he claimed, specifically warning Thomas about the dangers of taking shortcuts through less traveled areas. "Your son was a fine young man, Mrs. McCready," Patrick told her, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "Read me of my own younger brother back in County Cork. I tried to convince him to wait for a larger group to travel with, but he was eager to reach home. Said he had promises to keep to his dear mother. Sha produced a map marked with the route they claimed to have recommended, the longer but safer main road that would have taken Thomas directly through Springfield. They even provided the names of other travelers who had been at the trading post that day and could confirm their version of events. Elinor left the meeting impressed by the brothers' obvious concern and their detailed records. But something bothered her about the encounter, a feeling she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't until she was halfway back to Springfield that she realized what had troubled her. Patrick Sullivan had known far too much about her son's personal circumstances, details that Thomas would never have shared with strangers. How had Patrick known that Thomas was her only child? How had he known about the promises her son had made regarding the farm purchase? How had he known that Thomas carried exactly $3,000 in gold, a figure Elinor had mentioned to no one during her investigation? That night, in her room at Springfield's Palmer House, Elinor McCready made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to Illinois with her questions unanswered, she would remain in Missouri and conduct the investigation that local authorities seemed unwilling or unable to undertake. She rented a small house on the outskirts of Springfield and began what amounted to a one-woman intelligence operation. Using techniques she had learned during the war, she created detailed files on every missing traveler case she could identify, mapping disappearances, tracking patterns, and building a comprehensive picture of what she was becoming convinced was organized criminal activity. Elinor's investigation benefited from several factors that had worked against previous inquiries. As a woman, she was not seen as threatening by the men she questioned, leading them to speak more freely than they might with male investigators. Her war experience had taught her to recognize deception and inconsistency in testimony. Most importantly, she had the time and resources to conduct a thorough, systematic investigation rather than the cursory inquiries that had satisfied local officials. By December 1866, Elinor had documented 47 cases of travelers who had disappeared along routes recommended by Sullivan's trading post. More significantly, she had identified a pattern in the types of victims. They were invariably men traveling alone, carrying substantial amounts of money with destinations that meant their absence would not be immediately noticed. But Elinor's most crucial discovery came through an unexpected source, a conversation with Mary Catherine O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who worked as a seamstress in Joplin and had grown up in the same county in Ireland as the Sullivan brothers. Mary Catherine O'Brien possessed information that would prove devastating to the Sullivan brothers, but she was terrified to share it. During a chance meeting with Elinor McCready at a church social in January 1867, she mentioned recognizing the brothers' accents as being from County Cork. When Elinor expressed interest in learning more about their background, Mary Catherine's demeanor changed dramatically. "Those men," she whispered, glancing around nervously, "they're not who they claim to be. In Ireland, they were known by different names and their reputations. Mrs. McCready, there are things about those brothers that would curdle your blood." According to Mary Catherine, the men calling themselves Patrick and Sha Sullivan had been known in Ireland as Patrick and Seamus Ollie. They had fled County Cork in 1862 after being suspected of involvement in a series of robberies that targeted travelers on remote country roads. The local constabulary had been closing in on them when they disappeared, presumably having sailed for America under assumed names. "My own uncle was a constable in those days," Mary Catherine explained during a private meeting at Elinor's house. "He told me the O'Malley brothers had a system. They would learn which farmers were traveling to market with money, then arrange for bandits to rob them on isolated roads. The victims were often found dead, even when they offered no resistance." This information provided Elinor with a crucial piece of the puzzle. The Sullivan brothers weren't opportunistic criminals who had stumbled into murder. They were experienced killers who had fled Ireland, specifically to escape prosecution for similar crimes. Their operation in Missouri was essentially a refinement of techniques they had perfected in their homeland, but Mary Catherine's revelations came with a terrible price. Within 2 weeks of sharing this information with Elinor, she disappeared from her boarding house in Joplin. Her landlady reported that she had left suddenly during the night, taking only a small bag of personal belongings. No one in the Irish community had any idea where she might have gone, and she was never seen in the area again. Eleanor understood immediately that Mary Catherine's disappearance was connected to their conversation. Somehow, the Sullivan brothers had learned about the seamstress's revelations and had taken action to silence her. This meant that Eleanor's own investigation was no longer secret and that she was now in considerable danger. But instead of fleeing Missouri, Eleanor McGreedy made a decision that demonstrated both remarkable courage and strategic thinking. If local authorities were either unable or unwilling to investigate the Sullivan brothers, she would provide them with evidence so overwhelming that they would have no choice but to act. The key to building an unassailable case, Eleanor realized, lay in following the money. Every murder committed by the Sullivan network involved the theft of significant amounts of gold and cash. That stolen wealth had to be converted into usable currency somehow, and the process of conversion would leave traces that could be followed by a determined investigator. Eleanor began spending her days in Springfield's financial district, visiting banks, currency exchanges, and gold dealers under the pretense of conducting her own business transactions. What she discovered was a complex web of financial relationships that centered around Cornelius McBride, the owner of Springfield's largest currency exchange. McBride, she learned, had been accepting unusually large quantities of gold for conversion to paper money, often in amounts that seemed far too large for the modest mining operations he claimed as sources. More significantly, many of these transactions coincided with the dates when travelers had disappeared near Sullivan's trading post. But Elena's investigation into McBride's operation revealed something even more disturbing. The currency exchange was just one node in a network that included several of Springfield's most prominent citizens. The stolen gold was being systematically laundered through legitimate businesses with the profits shared among a group that included merchants, bankers, and even city officials. This discovery explained why the disappearances had been ignored or dismissed by local authorities. The Sullivan brothers weren't just operating with the passive indifference of corrupt officials. They were part of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of southwest Missouri's power structure. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Missouri Ozarks intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Eleanor McCready's dangerous investigation. By February 1867, Eleanor had assembled a file that documented not just the murders themselves, but the entire economic ecosystem that made them profitable. Her evidence included financial records, witness testimonies, and physical evidence that she had gathered during careful searches of areas where victims had disappeared. But Eleanor also understood that her evidence would be worthless if presented to the wrong authorities. Local officials were either part of the conspiracy or too intimidated to act against it. She needed to find someone in federal law enforcement who could not be bought, threatened, or influenced by the local power structure. Her solution was to contact Captain James Hartford, a federal marshal based in St. Louis whom she had known during the war. Hartford had served with her husband's regiment and had a reputation for incorruptible integrity. More importantly, he had the authority to investigate crimes that crossed state lines and involved the murder of federal citizens. Eleanor's letter to Hartford, sent in early March 1867, was a masterpiece of careful documentation. Rather than making wild accusations, she presented her evidence systematically, allowing Hartford to draw his own conclusions about the scope and nature of the conspiracy. She included copies of financial records, witness testimonies, and detailed maps showing the correlation between disappearances and the routes recommended by Sullivan's trading post. Hartford's response was immediate and decisive. He would travel to Missouri personally to investigate Eleanor's allegations, but she must take every precaution for her own safety until he arrived. The federal marshal understood, even from Eleanor's carefully worded letter, that she had uncovered something far more dangerous than simple banditry. But the Sullivan brothers had their own sources of information within federal law enforcement, and they learned of Hartford's planned investigation within days of his decision to travel to Missouri. The network that had protected them for 3 years was now mobilizing to eliminate the threats to their operation. Both the federal marshal and the persistent widow who refused to abandon her search for the truth. Captain James Hartford arrived in Springfield on March 15, 1867, traveling under an assumed name and with minimal official paperwork to avoid alerting local authorities to his investigation. His first meeting with Elena McGreedy took place in the basement of a Lutheran church whose pastor had agreed to provide a secure location for their discussions. What Elena shared during that 3-hour meeting exceeded even Hartford's expectations for the scope of the criminal conspiracy. Her meticulously documented evidence revealed not just a series of murders, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had corrupted entire communities and generated profits that rivaled legitimate businesses. Hartford was particularly struck by Elena's discovery of the financial network. Mrs. McCready, he told her, studying her charts and records, "What you've uncovered here isn't just murder for profit. This is organized crime on a scale I've never encountered. These men have essentially created their own shadow economy built on blood money." But Hartford also recognized the danger that Eleanor's investigation had created for both of them. The Sullivan brothers' network included people with connections to federal law enforcement, and word of his investigation was almost certainly spreading through channels that could compromise his safety. His solution was to move quickly and decisively, launching simultaneous raids on multiple locations before the conspiracy could organize its defenses. On the morning of March 18, 1867, federal agents descended on Sullivan's trading post, Cornelius McBride's currency exchange, and the homes of 6 suspected co-conspirators. What they found at Sullivan's trading post would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers. Hidden beneath the false floor that Eleanor had suspected, federal agents discovered not just the ledgers documenting hundreds of victims, but physical evidence that told a story of systematic murder spanning 3 years. The hidden chamber contained personal belongings from dozens of victims, watches, jewelry, family photographs, and letters that painted heartbreaking pictures of men traveling home to loved ones they would never see again. But most disturbing were Patrick Sullivan's detailed notes describing the psychological techniques he used to identify profitable victims and manipulate them into taking routes where they could be easily murdered. One particularly chilling entry dated January 1866 described Thomas McCready in clinical terms. Young Irish-American recently returned from California gold fields carrying approximately $3,000 in dust and nuggets, traveling alone to Illinois to purchase farm, mother is widow, no other family members likely to investigate quickly if he fails to arrive. Recommended Devil's Backbone route with camping spot at Widow's Creek. Informed S. Hartley and crew to expect him March 20th, but the most damning evidence was Patrick's meticulous financial records showing how the profits from each murder were distributed among the conspiracy's members. Sheriff Thomas Dalton received $200 from every victim's stolen wealth. Cornelius McBride took a 15% commission on all gold converted to currency. Even Springfield's mayor, Robert Crenshaw, received monthly payments that totaled more than his official salary. The raid on McBride's currency exchange revealed the sophisticated money laundering operation that had made the murders profitable. McBride had been converting stolen gold into legitimate currency, then investing the proceeds in local businesses that provided both cover for the money's origins and steady returns for the conspirators. Meanwhile, searches of the suspected murder sites yielded physical evidence that corroborated Eleanor's theories. At Widow's Creek, where Thomas McGreedy had supposedly camped, federal agents found personal belongings buried in shallow graves along with human remains that showed clear evidence of violent death. But the most shocking discovery came during the arrest of Sheriff Thomas Dalton. In his personal safe, investigators found detailed correspondence with Patrick Sullivan dating back to 1864, revealing that Dalton had not merely accepted bribes to ignore the murders, he had actively participated in planning them. One letter from Sullivan to Dalton, dated September 1866, read, The McGreedy woman continues asking questions. Her son's case was one of our most profitable, and she seems determined to learn the truth. Perhaps it's time she joined her boy on the Devil's Backbone trail. These persistent types rarely give up on their own, and she's becoming a genuine threat to our arrangement. Dalton's reply was equally chilling. Agreed about the created problem, but killing a woman will draw federal attention. Better to arrange an accident when she returns to Illinois. Make it look like bandits on the road home. I can provide details about her travel plans. The correspondence made clear that Eleanor McCready had been living under a death sentence for months, saved only by her decision to remain in Missouri and continue her investigation rather than returning home as the conspirators expected. As word of the arrest spread through southwest Missouri, the true scope of the Sullivan conspiracy became apparent. The network had included not just the obvious participants like Dalton and McBride, but dozens of seemingly respectable citizens who had profited from the blood money, merchants who had sold goods purchased with stolen gold, bankers who had provided loans secured by laundered currency, and officials who had received bribes to misdirect investigations. The economic impact of the conspiracy's collapse was immediate and severe. Several Springfield businesses failed when their connections to the stolen money were revealed. The city's currency exchange closed permanently, leaving legitimate customers scrambling to recover their savings. Even Springfield's First Methodist Church faced financial crisis when investigators revealed that a substantial portion of their building fund had come from donations made with laundered murder profits. But the conspiracy's most disturbing revelation came from Patrick Sullivan himself during his interrogation by federal agents. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the certainty of execution, he provided a full confession that revealed the true scale of their operations. Between April 1864 and March 1867, the Sullivan Network had murdered 127 people along the various routes through southwest Missouri. The victims had carried a combined total of more than $400,000 in gold and currency, an astronomical sum for the era. The murders had been planned and executed with military precision using information networks that rival those of professional intelligence services. We weren't bandits, Patrick explained to investigators with disturbing pride. Bandits are crude, impulsive creatures who take foolish risks for small rewards. We were businessmen who understood that information is more valuable than weapons and that systematic planning eliminates most risks while maximizing profits. Sha Sullivan's confession was less detailed but equally chilling. He described the actual murders with the detached professionalism of a soldier discussing combat operations. Most victims had been killed quickly and efficiently, often by members of the conspiracy who were skilled in violence, but unknown to the victims. The murders were designed to look like bandit attacks or accidents, with bodies disposed of in ways that made discovery unlikely. But the brothers' confessions also revealed something that terrified investigators. The Sullivan Network was not unique. They had been in contact with similar operations in other states, sharing techniques and occasionally coordinating activities. The systematic murder of travelers for profit was becoming an organized criminal industry, with networks spanning multiple states. The trials of the Sullivan conspiracy members began in St. Louis federal court in October 1867, drawing national attention to what newspapers called the Missouri murder machine. The evidence presented by Eleanor McCready and federal investigators revealed a level of criminal sophistication that shocked even experienced lawmen. Patrick and Sha Sullivan were convicted of 127 counts of murder and executed by hanging on February 14, 1868. Their executions drew crowds of over 3,000 people, many of them family members of victims who had traveled from across the country to witness justice being served. Even in death, Patrick Sullivan showed no remorse, reportedly telling the prison chaplain, "We gave those men quick deaths, which is more mercy than this world usually provides." Sheriff Thomas Dalton and 12 other co-conspirators conspirators received life sentences in federal prison. Cornelius McBride and 6 additional conspirators were sentenced to 20 years each. The trials revealed the full scope of the network's corruption and provided closure for families who had spent years wondering about their missing relatives. Eleanor McCready became something of a national hero. Praised in newspapers across the country for her determination and investigative skills, the federal government offered her a position with the newly formed investigative division that would eventually become the FBI. But she declined, choosing instead to return to Illinois and her quiet life on the family farm. But Eleanor's victory came at a tremendous personal cost. She had discovered the truth about her son's murder, but that knowledge brought no peace. Thomas McCready had died violently and alone. His dreams of buying a farm and starting a family destroyed by men who saw him as nothing more than a source of profit. The detailed descriptions of his final hours revealed during Patrick Sullivan's confession haunted Elena for the rest of her life. The Sullivan case also exposed the vulnerability of America's transportation networks to organized criminal activity. The federal government responded by establishing regular patrol routes along major travel corridors and creating communication systems that allowed law enforcement agencies in different states to coordinate investigations. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Sullivan conspiracy was the questions it raised about trust and community in post-Civil War America. The network had succeeded for 3 years, not through violence and intimidation, but through the brothers' ability to appear as helpful, respectable members of their community. They had exploited the natural human tendency to trust those who seem kind and helpful, using that trust to identify and murder their victims. The trading post at Hellhound Crossing was burned to the ground by federal agents after the investigation concluded, but the intersection where it stood continued to be avoided by travelers for decades afterward. Local residents reported feeling an inexplicable sense of unease when passing the site, though whether this was due to supernatural influences or simply the psychological impact of knowing what had occurred there remains a matter of speculation. The case files from the Sullivan investigation were sealed by federal authorities and remain classified to this day, though some historians believe this is due to the discovery of similar criminal networks in other states rather than any supernatural elements in the Missouri case. The full scope of organized criminal activity targeting travelers in post-Civil War America may never be completely understood. In 1902, 35 years after the Sullivan brothers' execution, construction workers building a railroad line through the Ozarks discovered a mass grave containing the remains of 47 people along the Old Devil's Backbone Trail. Personal belongings found with the bodies matched descriptions from the Sullivan case files, confirming that even the brothers' detailed confessions had not revealed the full extent of their crimes. The discovery of additional victims so many years after the brothers' deaths raised disturbing questions about the true scope of their operation. Had they been operating longer than anyone realized? Were there other murder sites that investigators had never discovered? Most unsettling of all, had other members of their network escaped justice and continued their activities elsewhere? Eleanor McCready died in 1894, taking many secrets of her investigation to her grave. Her personal papers donated to the Illinois Historical Society revealed that she continued researching similar disappearances in other states until her death. Convinced that the Sullivan Network had been part of a much larger criminal enterprise that stretched across the American frontier. Among her papers was a letter she had begun writing to federal authorities just weeks before her death, describing what she believed were similar operations in Colorado, Nebraska, and Texas. The letter was never completed, but her notes suggest she had identified patterns of disappearances that mirrored the Missouri case in disturbing detail. The final mystery of the Sullivan case lies not in what was discovered, but in what remains hidden. Federal investigators estimated that the brothers had murdered 127 people, but Patrick Sullivan's own records suggest the number was significantly higher. During his final confession, He alluded to special arrangements for certain high-value targets, but died before providing details about these cases. Modern historians who have studied the available records believe that the Sullivan brothers may have been responsible for the disappearances of several prominent individuals whose deaths were never officially linked to the conspiracy. These cases include a California state legislator who vanished while traveling to Washington, D.C., a wealthy mine owner who disappeared between Missouri and Illinois, and at least 3 federal officials whose deaths were attributed to unrelated causes. The trading post at Hellhound Crossing was rebuilt in 1889 as a legitimate business, but it failed within 2 years when travelers refused to stop at the location. The intersection itself was eventually bypassed by newer roads, and today the site is accessible only by foot through dense forest that has reclaimed the old trails. Local residents of the Ozarks still speak in hushed tones about the Sullivan brothers, though the stories have evolved over generations into something approaching folklore. Some claim that the spirits of their victims still haunt the old trails, warning travelers away from dangerous paths. Others insist that descendants of the conspiracy's survivors still live in the area, maintaining the old code of silence that protected the network for so many years. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Sullivan case is how easily it could be repeated. The brothers succeeded not through supernatural abilities or exceptional criminal genius, but through careful observation, systematic planning, and the exploitation of social trust. They identified vulnerable targets, created plausible scenarios for their disappearances, and built a network of corruption that made investigation nearly impossible. The case serves as a stark reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most dangerous criminals are frequently those who appear most helpful and trustworthy. In a world where travelers still rely on the advice and assistance of strangers, the lessons of Hellhound Crossing remain disturbingly relevant. The Sullivan brothers' legacy lives on in the careful attention federal law enforcement pays to patterns of disappearances along travel routes, in the databases that track missing persons across state lines, and in the healthy skepticism that modern investigators bring to cases where local authorities seem reluctant to investigate, but their most enduring legacy may be the questions their case raises about the nature of community and trust in American society. How many other criminal networks operated in the chaos of post-Civil War America? How many disappeared travelers were victims of organized murder rather than random violence? And most unsettling of all, how many similar operations continue to this day, hidden behind facades of respectability and protected by networks of corruption that make discovery nearly impossible? This mystery shows us that the most terrifying crimes are often those that hide in plain sight, perpetrated by people who seem ordinary, helpful, and trustworthy. The Sullivan brothers succeeded for 3 years not because they were criminal masterminds, but because they understood that most people want to believe in the goodness of their neighbors. They weaponized that trust, turning it into a tool for identifying and murdering innocent travelers whose only crime was seeking help from strangers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the full truth about the Sullivan conspiracy was ever revealed? The case files remain partially classified even today, suggesting that federal investigators discovered connections and evidence that are still considered too sensitive for public release. Leave your comment below. We'd love to hear your theories about what really happened in those Missouri Ozark Hills. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries from America's past. The shadows of history hold many secrets, and we'll continue exploring them together. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous criminals are often those who seem most eager to help.